So welcome to the attendees that have joined. I think there's 27 of us now. We'll just wait another minute or two before we get started. So I think that we will slowly start with the introductions. Maybe more people will join, but let me start introducing myself. My name is Karen Olsen from UNIP-DTU Partnership, and today moderating this session for the Sustainable Development Initiative webinar on mainstreaming sustainable development in carbon markets. And you see here the program of the event. I will briefly introduce the speakers. But first, as an introduction, let you know about the Sustainable Development Initiative for Article 6, which is an initiative that has existed since 2017, supported by Belgium, Finland, Germany, Norway, and Sweden in this year, 2020. And the partners are UNIP-DTU Partnership and the Gold Standard Foundation. The objectives of the initiative is to be a party-driven dialogue with the aim to help overcome knowledge and political barriers for parties, mainly negotiators, to promote sustainable development through voluntary cooperation under Article 6. And this is based on the experience in the past with the Kyoto Protocol and the CDM, where promoting sustainable development was not always as intended. There were many opinions on whether this was successful or not, and it was quite late in the CDM history that a voluntary tool was made available for parties to assess and report on sustainable development. So it is on this background the initiative was established. And this year we have 3 work streams. Today, this webinar falls in our work stream 3 on outreach to share with you what the initiative is doing in the other 2 work streams, particularly on piloting of sustainable development tools and approaches. And in the first work stream, we're focused on the negotiations to share views and provide recommendations on how to promote sustainable development in the ongoing negotiations on the rule book on both Article 6.2 and 6.4. So for the presentations today, you will hear first a presentation by Sven Braben on a top-down perspective on what is the status of promoting sustainable development in the Article 6.2 text in the negotiations. And then you will hear a presentation from Owen from the Gold Standard, which is a bottom-up perspective on the status of promoting sustainable development from voluntary markets. And the third presentation is by Ana Lucia from Costa Rica on how sustainable development is assessed and promoted both in context of the CINAMEC transparency system and also for use in carbon markets. So once you've heard the presentations, we would like to have a discussion around how sustainable development is being mainstreamed in all spheres of the carbon markets. And in particular, what are the tools and practices to promote sustainable development? Before we go to the first presentation, a few housekeeping notes here. Speakers will use their cameras. I think from the webinar that if you want to say something, you can raise your hand or type comments and questions in the chat. We will record the webinar and make it available after the session today. And in case of any technical issues, Matt from the Gold Standard can answer questions. And then you can find more information about the Sustainable Development Initiative in this link on the website. So over to you, Sven.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Lima in Peru. It's a pleasure for me to talk today about the draft rules on Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement and the lessons learned from CDM. Just a quick introduction about myself. I used to be a negotiator in the UNFCCC process myself, more than 10 years for the government of Liechtenstein. And in that capacity, I was also leading negotiations of our group, the Environmental Integrity Group, in carbon markets, yeah, did that for more than 10 years until 2017. So now let's start into our presentation. The aim is to show the involvement of sustainable development, first in the CDM and then in the draft process of, or in the drafting process of Article 6.4, the mechanism under the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. My outline is, yeah, as I said, I will give a brief overview about sustainable development in the CDM as well as 6.4, and then I end with some conclusion. Next slide. And next slide. So sustainable development and the CDM. Sustainable development in the CDM was actually a core purpose under the Kyoto Protocol. So Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol read that the purpose of the CDM shall be to assist non-Annex 1 parties to achieve sustainable development. Unfortunately, this objective was not supported by any provisions, and it lacked any implementation provisions. There was no guidance on sustainable development criteria, no monitoring, reporting, or verification requirements. So everything was moved to the national prerogative of the host country as a DNA. And that led at the end to a very weak assessment of this feature, sustainable development. So everything was about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the left and right impacts of this goal were somehow not considered. So that led to various cases of registered projects with negative environmental, negative social, or health impact. And the problem was that there was also no grievance mechanisms where stakeholders could have complained in these cases. Next slide, please. And at the end, some parties said, okay, that is not our intention of the mechanism, and they came up with the idea, or with giving the CDM Executive Board the mandate in South Africa, 2011, to develop voluntary measures to highlight co-benefits of the CDM. Sustainable development was supposed to be strengthened through these voluntary measures, which ended up in the approval of the so-called CDM Sustainable Development Tool. Karen mentioned that in the introduction. The approval was in 2012 at the Doha COP. Together, at the end, the impact of this tool remained really weak. The application of the tool took until 2014 before it went live, so it took some time. And it remained completely voluntary. So it did not become a part of the project approval process. So whether you had sustainable development information or not was completely irrelevant for the approval itself. And moreover, it only consisted of a voluntary declaration of these benefits or co-benefits. So no requirement to verify the claim or to monitor the claim over time. And at the end, it also did not contain any safeguards to avoid negative consequences. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So that led to some important lessons learned when it came to the negotiation of a new mechanism under the Paris Agreement in 2015. So the first lesson was that parties gave a stronger mandate to sustainable development, which can be seen in the number of cases where sustainable development was mentioned. In the Kyoto Protocol, in Article 12, it was mentioned once, and in Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, sustainable development was referred to 3 times. It also, the agreement itself and the accompanying implementing decisions, they also mandated the parties and the subsidiary bodies to develop rules, modalities, procedures, including on provisions on sustainable development. Next slide, please. Another lesson that was learned from the CDM, as well as the experience with the tool, was that parties, before going into the rule book negotiations, submitted really detailed ideas and positions on how to embed sustainable development better in the future. At the Sustainable Development Initiative, we have identified and analyzed these elements based on the submissions of all parties that have done so in 2017, and we identified sustainable development elements such as governance, safeguards, including a grievance mechanism, safeguards, then stakeholder inclusivity, including a grievance mechanism, the assessment of sustainable development, the monitoring and verification of sustainable development, and finally, the reporting. Next slide, please. So how did that translate into the current text? What of these ideas of parties ended up in the text? That's what I want to give an overview now. So we start with the safeguards. Safeguards were considered in the Article 6.4 draft. Here it says that every activity shall avoid negative environmental and social impact. Was this a lesson learned from CDM? Yes. The rules of CDM did not contain safeguards for environmental or social impact. And now in the draft of the 6.4 activity design, they are considered as a mandatory from the start, which is quite an improvement. The next element is stakeholder consultation. This is considered in Article 6.4 as well. Here it says that the activity shall undergo local and, where appropriate, subnational stakeholder consultation consistent with domestic arrangement, etc. And there was also a reference to indigenous people. Here we also see a lessons learned from the CDM. The CDM did have a reference to stakeholder consultation, but very, very high level. And the formulation of the current draft allows for a more enhanced stakeholder consultation. Next slide, please. In addition, we also have now a grievance mechanism in the Article 6.4 draft. It says that stakeholders, activity participants, and participating parties may appeal decisions of the supervisory body, the central governing body of the new mechanism. Lessons learned from the CDM? Yes, because a grievance mechanism did not exist on the CDM. There was only something called a request for review, but the consequences, the processes, they were all not clear. And it was only the parties that were able to request a review. And I'm not aware if there was ever a request for review in the CDM history. But there I'm a bit my knowledge ends in that regard. However, the current rule in the Article 6.4 draft contains a risk that the supervisory body may not be objective because he has at the end to examine his own decisions. I think, or we think, that that could be minimized by passing provisions that address that risk and keep a minimum level of objectivity in place. So the last element is subdivided in 4 parts: sustainable development. Here the information requirements. Is sustainable development a participation requirement in Article 6.4? Yes, it is. And in detail, 6.4 reads now that the host party shall ensure that it has indicated publicly how its participation in the mechanism contributes to sustainable development. And here we also have a lessons learned from the CDM, because the obligation to publicly indicate how the activity contributes to sustainable development as a participation requirement is a clear improvement to the CDM. And it is also coherent to come back to the sustainable development issue in the part of the approval process, where the host party has to confirm that the activity fosters sustainable development and has to inform about how that happens. And this explanation requirement is another lesson learned from the CDM, because in the CDM process there was no such thing than laying out an explanation why an activity is contributing to sustainable development. That was completely up to the countries, and the practice implementation was just ticking a box, and that's it. So this is a clear improvement towards the status quo of the CDM. The last two elements, next slide please. The last two elements, sustainable development, were guidance on assessment of sustainable development and guidance on monitoring of sustainable development. And here, unfortunately, we can't find any reference. It was not considered in the negotiations in Madrid, in the last round of negotiations in 2019. And that is a bit of a downer, because this is an important element to create learning and to build up knowledge. A lesson learned from the CDM, I didn't want to put in no, because I think this can still be achieved. Next slide, please. So I'm concluding here now to give you an overview that the draft rules and procedures of the Article 6.4 mechanism have indeed taken up several sustainable development elements which were not considered by the CDM. For example, the safeguards, a stakeholder consultation with a grievance mechanism, and enhanced reporting on sustainable development. However, the draft rules do not contain any provisions on assessing or monitoring sustainable development, which is an important lesson yet to be learned, since it could assist parties, especially those with limited capacities, to achieve their objectives beyond greenhouse gas mitigation. Next slide, please. And the reason why I say there's still time is because when we started in 2018 with the rulebook negotiation, or actually they should have ended there, but in fact they started there. We ended up with the first draft of the Article 6 rulebook without almost any reference to sustainable development. And sustainable development element, as I have described just now, they just entered in the intersessional negotiations in Bonn 2019, and then when were further defined thanks to the presidency of Chile in the final hours of COP25 in Madrid. So at the moment we are still looking at a draft. It is not agreed text, and we have two more sessions, an intersessional in 2021 and the COP21 and the COP in 2021 in Glasgow in UK. So we will now try to follow up with the incoming presidency of the UK that we need guidance or forum that allows for the exchange on information or on experiences to learn about how to assess sustainable development and monitor it over time. And my last slide is the final one to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Sven, for this presentation. And while you spoke, I realized that I forgot something important in the introduction. I forgot to ask participants to please introduce themselves in the chat, because we can't see who you are. We can just see that the number is 48, but we actually can't see who is attending. So if you could just say your name and your affiliation, then we can know who you are, and that would be nice to know for the discussions after the next presentations. So over to you, Owen, for the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, and hi everybody. Great to be with you. Thanks to Aita for the platform today. I'm Owen Hewlett. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at the Gold Standard Foundation Switzerland. And if you go on a slide there, Karen, I'll just quickly introduce ourselves. It's a nice, sorry, on another slide. It's a nice segue actually from what Sven provided there as an overview of the relative successes and largely failures of CDM in the context of sustainable development, because that's really where, you know, our genesis as an organization was that in 2003 WWF saw those same gaps that Sven outlined and created the gold standard as a label to be applied to CDM and JI, although CDM is the one that that gathered momentum. So as far back as 2003, those gaps have been very clear in civil society's mind. And the slightly odd name of gold standard is the gold standard of CDM. So we're not the gold standard as in, you know, the mineral, but the metal rather, but rather the carbon markets. And they founded us predominantly because of sustainable development integrity. And as we've grown, we've become more and more influential on the environmental integrity side. And we really see our mission, as it happens, is climate security and sustainable development for all. So you could definitely see, you know, that our mission is a function of, if you get sustainable development right, you'll get a better climate result, and vice versa. You can see some of the numbers on the screen there. That's actually already out of date because of the market uptick that some of you might be aware of, but gives you an idea of the current state and trends of gold standard. If you go on a slide, Karen, what I would say, just to reflect on what Sven was saying, we really took those core principle provisions and created good practice standards around them to label CDM and subsequently to issue voluntary carbon credits. And I wanted to give a quick overview of where we are with those things now. So on the inclusivity stakeholder side, and the reason I put that first, actually, I know we often start with safeguards, do no harm, but the thing that I think we're most proud of, the thing that we think actually makes the most difference, is inclusivity. Or maybe put another way, you get a lot less safeguarding issues if you've included people. And it's very much about local and affected stakeholders. So affected doesn't necessarily mean local, and vice versa. So we've evolved into that distinction over time. And we have kind of public transparency on, you can go to our registry and see those reports anytime. With regards safeguarding, we rewrote our entire standard system back in 2017 and rebuilt the safeguards to align with the UNDP safeguarding standard and the IFC safeguarding standard. So you can go and see those at their respective websites. And you know, we've always felt that it's slightly odd to promote one UN policy instrument while ignoring another. So you know, to follow the UNFCCC but not the UNDP seems a bit odd to us. And as it happens, we were already pretty well aligned. We actually went a little bit further in gender and water sensitivity, that we felt neither of those quite went far enough. Then the question I'm always asked is, should we really be bothered about co-benefits? Isn't that just complicating markets? But to me, if you've gone to the trouble, as you should, of safeguarding and inclusivity, then SDG impact isn't particularly hard to do. That said, it's not a language that everybody speaks. We aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals because, again, it just makes total sense to do that. It cross-reference with the Paris Agreement. And later this year, you'll see a series of SDG impact reporting tools for a variety of different project types. And then lastly, on the standard side, something that gets overlooked a little bit is good governance. So one of the questions I was asked in Madrid quite a number of times was, what qualifies a small Swiss foundation to serve as a compliance instrument, as we will do in CORSIA? And it's a good question, right? You know, it's, you know, all of the voluntary standards have to some extent invented their own governance, but we wanted to be able to robustly answer that. And so we became an ICL Alliance member this year. That's the same membership club of good practice as standards like Fair Trade and FSC and Rainforest Alliance, etc., that you might be aware of. And then the grievance side of stuff, I always think with standard systems, if you can't find, if they haven't published the grievances that are going on, it's not because there are no grievances, it's because they don't know about them. Standards are not there to guarantee there will never be a problem. What they do try and guarantee is that the risk of problems is minimized, but where they do arise, they get dealt with properly. So if you go to our website, again, one of the things we're most proud of is our grievance page. And some of those can be very painful for us. You know, you're acting against your own interests sometimes. But like I say, if you don't have any grievances published, it's not because they don't exist, it's because you don't know about them. So take grievances as reassuring, I would say. If we go on a slide there, please, Karen, I wanted to get into a little bit of the state and trends of markets more broadly than Article 6. And there GS has two main programs running. Today, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Initiative, which Karen already outlined, and we're super proud to be part of that. Our piece of that puzzle this year is predominantly in the pilot road testing phase, which I'll talk about in a minute. But as I say, on our website, you can go and see a guidance we wrote for the development of automated tools for SDG impact reporting, and the first 3 tools will be launched for testing this year. So that'll be a one-stop shop for projects to report their SDG impacts. If you go on a slide, Karen. Just getting into carbon markets, and I use the word markets plural there because I know we talk about Article 6, which is both a market and a non-market mechanism under one clause or subclause or whatever you call it. What we see is a shift from the last 15 years of a broad generic voluntary market and the CDM for compliance and later joining the voluntary club into a series of fragmented market use cases. So Article 6 IPMOs is a use case of potentially market mechanisms to support transfers between countries. And that has to be propped up by the asset which has attributes that serve that use case. And there across the top, I've just named 5 different use cases that I can think of just off the top of my head. So voluntary offsetting is not the same as transferring between 2 countries. CORSIA is not the same as general voluntary offsetting. The South Africa carbon tax isn't the same as any of those. Now, what underpins those is a set of common practices and common attributes and a unitization. So things like additionality, methodology, and sustainable development provisions are common to those. But then Article 6, the use in that context as an IPMO requires certain things to enable it, like corresponding adjustments. That wouldn't work in the South Africa carbon tax context because that's a domestic instrument. So while we might have common provisions and a common base unit, we also need to think about the toggleable attributes, if that makes any sense, that define those use cases. And the reason I share that is just to say, sustainable development is a core provision. I'll come back to that in a minute. That's the observation I wanted to make, that it doesn't matter which use case. It's not limited to Article 6 only. It should be it should be a common provision, and I'm starting to see that happen. If we go on a slide there, Karen. Just to play that out a little bit, imagine a clean cooking, classic gold standard clean cooking project starting on the left. That's where the core sustainable development provisions should be. So we recognize that clean cooking is an activity that is heavily based on gender and gender sensitivity. It has influence on human health and water and access to energy. All those safeguards should be at the project level. And then as we go into market-based mechanisms, general market-based mechanisms, that's really what I'm saying, that additionality, etc., applies there. And then that same unit could split off into several use cases. So one unit could be eligible to play in several different markets as shown there, and each of those has its own attributes. And the reason I highlight it like this is just to say that if you look at the CORSIA provisions, sustainable development and safeguarding is a requirement of CORSIA, a compliance instrument. It's named in the Paris Agreement, as Sven said, and actually I'm part of the Mark Carney Voluntary Task Force, which some of you will have been monitoring, and it's named there as a core provision as well. So we are moving to a place where Article 6, actually as currently written, is keeping up with voluntary / sectoral compliance instruments, which are starting to treat this stuff as a requirement, not an option. If we go on a slide there, please, Karen. I just wanted to kind of bring that back together with my observation on this. So you can see on the left-hand side there just the various, just proliferation of forums that Gold Standard and myself particularly are involved in, all of which I'm very proud of, but all of which eat up a lot of time in my diary. But I wanted to kind of characterize that a little bit, which is to say that each of those has a view on what markets should be and that markets will fragment. There are core provisions, so a common language of what a market asset is. And then there are other provisions which are use case driven. So if you want to use it in South Africa carbon tax, that will have vintage, geography, double counting, double claiming requirements that may or may not be exactly the same as, say, CORSIA as a use case. But SD is very much a core provision, even though the journey we've been on hasn't always been. It's increasingly recognized that sustainable development improves that asset. One observation that I had, and I wanted to just quickly focus on it, and maybe a nice segue for Ana Lucia in a minute, is what we come up against. One of the big examples we're working on in the NDC partnership, what we come up against frequently, or maybe not come up against, but we perceive as a gap for capacity building, is working with host countries to understand this market fragmentation and the use case and how to take best advantage of it. So I think a lot of people look at markets and the need for things like corresponding adjustments as giving up an asset. But once you factor in sustainable development and the potential to use markets to bring things forward that may have been in a later round of the NDC, if you use it cleverly as a country, it can be hugely beneficial. You shouldn't be giving up units. You should be bringing forward units, and therefore there's no net loss to what you would have achieved anyway in a given 5-year period. And when you couple that with the sustainable development benefits, if you can couple that in with your SDG priorities, it becomes a super powerful mechanism. And one last slide, Karen, if I may. I just wanted to talk very quickly about the road testing of the Sustainable Development Initiative principles to Article 6 pilots. So for the end of this year, we're road testing these principles, which we've shared today, on at least 2 Article 6 pilots. One is around climate cooling and the other clean cooking. And the way we'll do that is to look at how those principles that Sven and I have talked about, how are they manifesting in the early design of Article 6 pilots, and providing advice on how to bridge the gap and any kind of gap findings and kind of recommendations to optimize. And we'll also be road testing the ICAT SD Sustainable Development Toolbox, as well as Gold Standards SDG impact reporting tools. So look out for some hopefully very interesting lessons learned in the context of Article 6. But I really wanted to sign off by saying what we learn in Article 6 is not unique to Article 6. We don't want to be inventing SD provisions for Article 6 ITMO use case that's somewhat different to voluntary use cases. That's because we don't want this kind of fragmentation of language. But also, if you're my clean cooking project, you want your options to be as open as possible. If it benefits you to sell into CORSIA or be used in an ITMO context or be used for voluntary offsetting, if the language is common and SD is part of it, then you have the most options available to you on the table. So in sum, I'm super excited about the direction of travel for sustainable development. I feel like we're winning. That doesn't mean that good practices abound. We still very much see our role as driving integrity and good practice, but very heartened to see it become core provision to a variety of market use cases. And I'm excited about how we make that consistent across those use cases. And I'll leave it there, Karen.
Thanks, Owen. I was just checking the chat while you were talking, and I actually don't see any introductions. But we can also get to know who is on the call on the webinar today when after we hear Ana Lucia's presentation. So Ana Lucia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm going to briefly discuss about how we are in Costa Rica integrating the enhanced transparency framework and its reporting with markets and a bit about that related to our private sector. If we can go to the next one, please. Yes, the next one. Okay, so this is happening under the framework of the design and implementation of the National Climate Change Metric System of Costa Rica. That is basically a platform that integrates the monitoring, reporting of climate action in order to promote efficiency and improve decision making based on data. So just to be a little bit more concrete on this, what this platform does is it captures data, it helps on its processing part, and then it helps on its reporting, and it provides a platform for sharing and helps sharing pretty graphs and tables on the information. This in line with the open data philosophy that we have on the system, and also it has an idea, a philosophy on open software. Since the first version of this platform is already implemented, it's available. At the end, I'm going to share you the link in case you want to check it up. And this goes along with the idea that there's a lot of very interesting and useful information related to climate change that historically has been very difficult to gather for countries, Costa Rica being one of them. And the idea is to make all this process more efficient in order to be able to comply with the reporting periods of the Enhanced Transparency Framework under the Paris Agreement, and also make the information available for decision makers, civil society, private sector, the academy, and other users that might find it useful. So if you go to the next one, please. It is organized in 3 main functional areas: mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, and then it has a transversal functional area related to sustainable development. That is a little the one that I'm going to focus in the next slides. Next one, please. So it is the system, as I was mentioning before, has been designed in order to support Costa Rica on the transition to the ETF. So this is how it is organized around the functional areas that I mentioned before, and the reporting provision that each functional area is going to cover on the ETF. So for example, on mitigation, we are right now exploring and implementing how we're going to help the process of data capture and processing of the greenhouse gas inventory, and also the archive and documentation will be more efficient under the CINAMEC process. And then the NDC monitoring, mitigation actions monitoring, and on the adaptation side, we're also doing some monitoring of the adaptation actions and the monitoring of the NDC part of adaptation that Costa Rica has integrated on this NDC. And then on climate finance, we are organizing and systematizing the information related to support received in order to make more efficient the reporting process on the BTRs that are going to be soon that we're going to start reporting soon. So if you go to the next one. So and what we are doing in order to implement one of the two of the areas that I just mentioned, that is the monitoring of the mitigation and adaptation actions, is we are designing a climate action registry that basically will capture both the mitigation and adaptation actions and its synergies, because where Costa Rica is going is actually integrating these two parts. We have been kind of working them apart, and that brings problems on sometimes what this action is actually just adaptation, is just mitigation. But if we kind of merge this together, we believe that there will be a lot of more of the impact will be bigger, and also it will be the idea of how to link this to sustainable development kind of becomes a little bit more clear. So this is just the basic process that we are doing right now. We started with first mapping of these actions to understand how we can design a registry that fits the mitigation and adaptation actions that are happening in Costa Rica, and that will happen in Costa Rica too. And also, we are right now implementing a registry that is basically the first part, and what I'm going to discuss in the next slides is basically focus on the mitigation part. That is the part that we have already a little bit more designed. The adaptation is still under conceptualization. But for the mitigation registry, what we wanted was not only to include the mitigation impact, but also to include other social and environmental impacts, and also to include how this mitigation action is contributing to transformational change. Because as I was mentioning before, for us it is crucial to start integrating the development agenda into the climate change agenda, and we see the very interesting path integrating this into this climate action registry. If you go to the next one, please. Oh, the previous, I'm sorry. And we are right now, we have guidance for integrating the mitigation actions on the CINAMEC, that is this climate change action registry. That the first box is already designed, and it was based on a WR guidance, the policy and action standard, that basically registered the impact related to mitigation. But right now we are working, making more, like strengthening this guidance with a component of estimation of sustainable development and a component of estimation of transformational change. We are currently doing a pilot that is based on the ICAT guidances. Go to the next one. Okay, so how does this relate to markets? This is basically the process that is going to happen in for a project to issue credits. So first, a project has to be registered on CINAMEC, and for being registered on the climate action registry of CINAMEC, it has to have the component of mitigation and its impact directly on mitigation, and also the component on sustainable development, and also the component on transformational change that we are right now working on. And after it is registered on the climate action registry, it can apply to the local market. That is the those letters that you see there, the Costa Rica compensation mechanisms. Because what we want in the bottom of this is that we want to incentivize not only mitigation actions, but we want to incentivize transformational actions that brings together closer to its sustainable development, that it brings together closer to the transformation that we want to see in our society, not only related to emissions, because for the size of Costa Rica, the reductions are definitely quite important and are part of the Costa Rican targets. But what we see most valuable actually is how to use the climate action to transform society, to make our society more just, to provide more jobs, to increase the opportunities. And this is what we see. This is what we think is so valuable, to make this connection and to use the incentives that the markets provide in order to help these other projects, like to give them a push and to speed up this action. So if you go to the next one. So how does this relate to the private sector? This is an interesting question because these have been designed for the general projects that will be joining the local market. But since the beginning, we haven't thought that the climate action would be only done by the government. So this applies in two ways to private sector. First, the first part is the private sector that want to issue credits, that want to implement projects, because they would definitely have to go through all this process to register the actions, to analyze how it is impacting on sustainable development, and to analyze how it is impacting on transformation change. But also the local market, the local is driven basically by a demand on the private sector. We have a program for making companies and industries carbon neutral, and that is the what drives the local market. So they will also have the possibility to incentivize this transformative action by buying these particular credits that would be sold in the local market. If you go to the next one, please. So what I've been discussing is basically the approach that we have on the national market. That is the one we can actually control. But when we have an Article 6 on place, I'm just checking my time, it will be also a criteria that will be used, because for Costa Rica, there's some rules that we are still trying to officialize. But just to give you a bit of what will be on those rules, for a project to be able to apply to the international markets under the Costa Rican, Article 6 particularly, it will have also to meet all this process, to be registered, to analyze its impact on sustainable development, and it will have a little bit more of higher standards related to sustainable development and transformational change. Because what we want is that if we have some credits that are being sold in the international market, then we will kind of sell our mitigation benefits, but then we want the sustainable development and transformational change benefits to stay in the country. So for us, it is very important that this estimation, that this part is done quite extensively on the projects in order to ensure that Costa Rica is advancing to this transformation on our society and on our economies, and to use the markets as an incentive to speed up this transformation. Okay, so if we go to the next one, yes, and this is the link of the system in case anyone wants to check it up. And I think that will be all from my side.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ana Lucia, for sharing your experience from Costa Rica, which in my experience supporting many countries on capacity building in the past it was CDM. Today it is for transparency, such as through ICAT. And Costa Rica is the most advanced countries in terms of the ambition to assess both sustainable development and the transformation impact, also of market approaches. And you even have a last slide here with questions and comments, which is what we've come to now. So we would welcome that participants speak up. I think that if there's a provision to unmute all attendees. Owen, would you know if that's possible?
Yeah. Hi everyone. So this is our system. So let me kind of just brief you. You should have a little hands up icon. If you do that, then Matt or I can unmute you and you can ask your question. You can also use the questions box. I see Matt has picked one out as well. And there's a few questions in there. So Matt, I'm not sure if you're able to. The question box on mine is a bit bunched up, but I don't know whether you can maybe read out a couple of questions and then we can direct them. If that's possible.
Sure. Okay, so they seem to mostly be to you at the moment, Owen. So hi everybody. The first question is from Laura, and it says, how has gold standard SDG reporting tools been aligned with global compacts and GRI's guidance on the SDG reporting for business?
Great. Karen, do you want to collect a few or should we go straight into them?
I'm happy to just take the first one.
Super. So yeah, I can very quickly answer that one. So we've been very cognizant of the various developments in SDG reporting. I would just say gold standard itself is its scope, if you like, is project activities, which lends itself to different impacts than say a company's impacts more generally. And also the types of activities are often not necessarily within company boundaries. So something like clean cooking, for example, isn't necessarily in company boundaries. So generally the impact metrics aren't going to be the same anyway, not alignable, if that makes sense. But what we've tried to do is create almost like an operating system where over time we can do overlays. So we have the basic foundational structure, and then we could create different versions of the same clean cooking tool. So there's a base code, and then if you wanted to do, say, a specific country's version of that, so it aligns with that specific country's priorities, then the idea is that we'll click a button and the impact metrics will align with the key priorities. And the same really with could be done for companies or specific markets, for example. So let's say South Africa carbon tax is very keen on say gender issues, then we can have that overlay as well. So cognizant of rather than directly aligned, but I don't think our scope directly aligned, so it's not a direct overlay we could make, but the provision is there, I would say. Yeah.
Would you like me to carry on reading out questions, or can you see them?
Yeah, Matt, if you can assist reading the questions, because I actually can't see them yet.
Sure. Okay. So there's one from Simon at Bafu, which maybe we could pick up offline, but just to sort of pick out a few questions within it that might be relevant. Do you, and this is more addressed to Owen as well, so do you gold standard or any other or other standards that you're aware of specify SD requirements that are generally applicable to all projects ahead of registering these projects? And if so, how do you phrase these, e.g. contribute to at least 2 of the SDGs? And do you have experience of how feasible it is to have the proposed SD benefits verified by third-party?
Yeah, that's a super interesting set of questions to unpack, actually. So maybe just take it in turn. So safeguards and inclusivity are consistent to all projects, although for obvious reasons, some safeguards are more applicable to certain projects than others. So you don't have like an animal husbandry issue in renewable energy generally, but at least hypothetically that applies, even if it's largely impossible for that sort of project to breach it. Then for SDG impacts, so we can be consistent, I think, at the project type level. So we're consistent for all clean cooking projects, and some impact you can be consistent across project types. But obviously, it doesn't necessarily make sense to make all metrics the same for all projects. So the way we're approaching it is have a tool per activity type with wherever we can have cross-cutting metrics, we'll certainly do that. I guess emissions reductions is an obvious one that is pretty cross-cutting. There's opportunities, I would say, in water, but not necessarily in some of the other SDGs. It becomes a little tricky. And then the question on assurance and verifiers is really interesting. And I was thinking as Sven was speaking, one of the reasons the CDM struggles to mandate SD in MRV is because of that, because it relies on, this is just one of the reasons, I'm not saying it's the reason, is because it relies on a third-party assurance community that is accredited to look at the carbon part. And if you add in other things, it becomes quite difficult to provide meaningful oversight and accreditation of those things. Because as I said, if you've got a clean cooking expertise versus a forestry expertise or something, then you start to need to build quite sophisticated accreditation approaches. So I suspect that's one reason on the pile of why CDM doesn't pursue that. For us at Gold Standard, we overcome it slightly differently. We actually spun out and created a new certification body called SustainCert. Because we feel that it's very difficult to provide assurance consistently if you just sort of outsource it to a general assurance community because of the reasons I suggested. So yeah, that was a very interesting insight, I thought.
Thanks, Owen. There's another question here from Marc Andre from Perspectives. How to reflect the very project-specific requirements and circumstances when assessing and monitoring SD aspects, SDG indicators and parameters, and at the same time ensure SD tools that can be commonly applied. How do the mentioned SD tools reflect this? That's question 1, and I don't know if someone wants to answer that, and we can move to question 2.
I'm happy to answer it, but they are coming my way a little bit. But I'd be really interested to hear Ana Lucia's thoughts on how to connect that back to national priorities, actually, because I think we can provide consistent tools in the way I've already described at specific project level and we overcome complexity by giving flexible options. So we'll have consistent metrics, but you'll have a range of SDGs that you could contribute to rather than just 2 or 3. So if your cook stove project is doing something really interesting, there's that normal cook stove projects wouldn't, there's room to add that in. So between flexibility and a range of options, we can provide enough consistency at the project level. But one of the things we wrestled with, and I thought it was interesting in what Ana Lucia was saying, is how do you connect the dots between activity level and national level priorities and make those things consistent? So, sorry, Ana Lucia, I don't want to put you on the spot with that, but your perspective would be super interesting.
Thank you, Owen. No, I was thinking that actually, I don't know, we have already an answer for that. We have mostly a lot of questions and a lot of trials, maybe. But what we are doing is that so there's kind of several layers of how to do this. First, you can just do it under the SDG goals, and then you can try the targets, and then you can try the particular indicators that each country decides which ones to measure. So what we're doing is that we are going a level under the target level in order to understand what is the impact that is having around the general goal. And these targets are the targets set by the national level, but what we want is to understand how the particular projects impact on the general target of the country. Understanding that probably there's not a direct link. I mean, it's not the indicator that the country is measuring is going to move with the particular project. Maybe it is, but maybe the measurement that the country used for the national level is not exactly the same that the country that the project uses. But we think that in this way it gives us a more clear way of understanding the impact of the project, more than just a general more than the general perspective that just using the goal. And this is useful for kind of linking these two levels, the national and the project level, and for understanding how we can promote other projects, other projects that might help Costa Rica get closer to the particular targets that it has set. I don't know if this was useful for the question asked.
Thanks, Ana Lucia. So just on another second part to this question as well. So how to best define SD parameters monitoring requirements on project type level, and at the same time enable measuring synergies with adaptation benefits and mitigation achievements, e.g. MRV on mitigation may already provide information on certain SD and adaptation aspects. I'm not sure who wants to answer that on our side. I'm going to pick on Owen if no one else is answering.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I guess, and it'd be interesting to hear whether, Sven, you've got any kind of views on the relevant policy instruments for adaptation and how those are treating sustainable development goal alignment. But I think just building on what Ana Lucia said, in a way, we can provide a generic tool for, I keep using clean cooking as an example, so let's stick with that. But where it starts to get really interesting is if you can create an overlay for that same tool in a specific country, such that all of the clean cooking projects in that country use the same version of the tool and the tool's metrics are aligned with the national priorities. Then I think you could start to think about these things in a programmatic way, which would be super interesting to explore. And I think similarly of adaptation and mitigation, I agree that when we think about mitigation and the methodological approaches we have in markets, for example, when you're calculating emission reductions or something, there's a lot of metrics that you sort of collect on the journey towards calculating that have multiple purposes and could be proxies for other SDGs. Some very simple ones like the creation of renewable energy, and providing energy access. So SDG 13 for climate and SDG 7 for energy access is a pretty obvious overlap. But there are more subtle ones as well along that journey, like in clean cooking, projecting the cooking times, for example, There's been a lot of discourse on connecting that with gender and health benefits, although I sort of regret that example because it's hyper complex, so we won't pick any further at that one. But yeah, Sven or Karen, I guess I don't know whether you guys have got any insights into the emerging discourse of SD and adaptation. That's an interesting question.
Well, yes, I've started working in the adaptation section now in our center, and understand that adaptation and sustainable development, if not the same, they're very highly overlapping. So what counts for sustainable development also counts for adaptation and resilience, but no, not in terms of markets. But I just turned on my camera because I think we are getting to the end of our session, and I see there is one last question, which is for Ana Lucia. So if you will allow us to just take this last one, which is on how the private sector measures their greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable development. What protocols do they use, and how does that speak to CINAMEC, if so? And yes, so I think the last question is for you, Ana Lucia.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So the private sector uses some protocols that are designed in the country under the program for carbon neutrality. That is what, as I mentioned before, a program for helping the companies and industries become carbon neutral. So it has a set of rules for measuring the emissions, and a set of rules on how they can, which projects can they use in order to reduce their emissions, how they can also measure that, and also they can compensate their emissions with mostly the offsets that are being sold in the local market, or they can also buy from the outside. But there's a specific set of rules for that. But what I think is interesting in this is that specific set of rules so far doesn't have a measurement of SDGs, and that is what we are trying to do with the pilots I commented before, that are related to how to integrate a measurement, an estimation on the impacts of sustainable development and transformational change on the climate, on the mitigation actions in Costa Rica that we are doing with support of the ICAT project. So far it doesn't have a particular methodology, but the methodology we're looking at is the guidelines built under the ICAT project.
Great. And that is, yeah, we're for the pilot work stream, we are exactly trying to share some tools and approaches built on those two approaches from Gold Standard and ICAT. But since we are above the hour now, I'd just like to conclude on the takeaways on the topic of this webinar about mainstreaming sustainable development and carbon markets. And as you've heard from Sven's presentation, the lessons learned from CDM were, if not just about how not to do it, I think we also have a lot of sort of good experience to build on, as Sven has explained, but we also have a lot of lessons learned on how to improve. And from Owen's presentation, we hear that sustainable development is in Article 6, we're still working on it, but across multiple carbon markets in plural, seeing sustainable development as a core provision, which is progress towards mainstreaming. And I think what Ana Lucia is bringing to this discussion is the example from national level. And we only had the time for one country experience today, but I was earlier in a webinar where there was experience from Kenya, also how the SDG framework since 2015 has become integrated into the transparency framework. And we see mainstreaming not only in the voluntary market and at activity and program level, but also at the national level, because it becomes a core component also of the transparency system for assessment of sustainable development and upscale policy-based approaches. This is also an indicator of mainstreaming of sustainable development. So these are some of my takeaways. And I'd be happy to hear if there are any other points from the panel in terms of your takeaways from this, also the questions.
Yeah, Karen, let me briefly add my conclusions on my takeaways on SD. SD being, I mean, SD is more than just a general a word. It is about health. It is about biodiversity and social jobs. It's the whole range of our society. Of our society content that apply here, and what I took away from this presentation today, from these presentations today, is that SD in fact is on the rise. It is on the rise from this top-down approaches in carbon markets. It is on the rise on the bottom up, from the bottom up side, as we learned from Owen in the voluntary carbon market. And we saw a nice presentation from Ana Lucia on how the interaction between the government and the private sector, where this can lead us to. And what we now need is what I ended my presentation with, to have an exchange of experiences, and for that we need the necessary forums. And I hope that one of these forums will one day be the UNFCCC. And they provide an excellent opportunity to have that established, and because we need the tools and the approaches to test sustainable development in terms of assessing it and how to monitor it, and that can only be done in a joint effort. At the end, it comes about how do we measure it, and it doesn't matter if it's top down or bottom up. The questions probably are more or less the same. That was my takeaway.
Yeah, I totally echo that, Karen. I think that all makes complete sense to me. And I think that the other takeaway from one of the last questions there is, you know, I don't want to dismiss how hard this stuff can be to do, to think about safeguards and SDGs. And, you know, not everybody has the capacity to do it. We work with, you know, refugee camp projects, for example, that really struggle with anything beyond the bare minimum. And I think part of the discourse, you know, it's great that it's on the rise. It's great that it's being a core provision. Part of the discourse is turning to and needs to continue to turn to capacity building, automation, standardization, all the things that can take away the pain of having to, each individual project or program having to think of their own way of doing this, because that's just a waste of brain power. That's kind of what our tools are trying to do. And I really like what Ana Lucia's work is trying to do in that regard too. Now, I think it was a very astute point, and sorry, I forget who raised it, around the assurance community. How can we prepare the assurance community to verify these things when they don't come necessarily from that background, without reinventing all the wheels all over again? So I think there's some very interesting inferences around how do we balance the growth and excitement around it with, you know, the very real challenges of capacity and infrastructure and automation. I think that's a very good comment somebody raised.
Yes, and I think last I've just seen that there are actually a lot of questions in the chat that we have not been able to answer. So thanks for the questions, and apologies that we have run out of time. But we are happy to engage also after the webinar, and we will share them on the website. So thanks for now, and thanks for being with us, and bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, guys.
Thank you.